Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode from the Empty Waiting Room. We're rounding up the podcast with the episode Where to Next? Why Connectedness and Collaboration is the Golden Thread. So, Nick, what are we going to cover on today's episode?
Well, thanks, Steve. As you say, this episode concludes the podcast with an exploration of why connectedness and collaboration is the golden thread that links all we do in creating a better future for our public services. And to do that, I'm in conversation with a guy called Tim Harlow, author of a lovely book which is called That's Something Else, a reflection on medicine and humanity. And together we reflect on how this has underpinned his whole practice, both as a GP and in palliative care. And why you just can't force connectedness and collaboration to happen. You have to be prepared to build the ground for it to happen. And then finally, I'm joined again by Emm, who was part of the first episode, and I'm joined by Steve as well. Both are invited back to examine why building relationships is the key activity, both strategically and operationally, and just reflecting on how this should happen. And the episode finishes with a personal reflection for me on what I've learned through conversations over these 5 episodes and where I think this now takes us in working with complexity in the future.
Great stuff. Well, great final episode. Thanks very much. I hope everybody enjoys it. Thanks. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our next episode of the podcast, The Empty Waiting Room. This one is Where to Next? So why connectedness and collaboration is the golden thread. So, Nick, if you want to introduce that, that'd be great.
Thanks, Steve. Well, anyway, welcome to what in fact will be the last episode in this podcast, The Empty Waiting Room. And the podcast is based on the main themes in my recent book of the same name. The empty waiting room is a kind of metaphor for the way we need to rethink how we deliver public services to people who have complex social needs. One that's much more citizen and consumer focused by allowing them to contribute much more actively to the design and delivery of the services they receive. I also argue in the book and through this podcast that this way is much cheaper than top-down hierarchical delivery because it's less wasteful of resources. So very appropriate in the current economic climate and the general debate about public sector reform. So in this last episode, I want to focus on the topic of connectedness and collaboration. And although it forms a specific chapter in the book, it's a theme that in fact is the golden thread in what we do both strategically and operationally in working with people who have complex and multiple needs. Quantum science, which is the underpinning scientific theory I use in my book, teaches that nothing comes into being, into our sight, except through the relationships that we make. Carlo Rovelli, a physicist, describes this as a network of kisses, a phrase that conveys both warmth and intimacy. And a major longitudinal study by the sociologists Robert Walding and Mark Schultz, looking at what makes for a good life, concludes that building positive human relationships are the foundation of happiness. So joining me for today's conversation, welcome back, Ben, my longtime friend and collaborator, and also to Tim Harlow, who's the author of a lovely book I've recently read called That's Something Else, a reflection of medicine and humanity. Tim, I'll get you to say something else a bit about your CV in a minute, but you're coming at this, I know from my conversations with you, both as a GP and also your experience in palliative care. So anyway, so welcome to you both. Ben, would you like just to introduce yourself and just say who you are and
Yeah, I'm
our connection?
I'm a former probation trust chief executive who then became a senior civil servant in the Ministry of Justice, and then left that all behind fairly quickly to become an independent management consultant, which I was lucky enough to do for 10 years before taking early retirement.
So Tim, perhaps you could say a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, I started as a zoologist and then switched to medicine, and then became a GP for 16 years and became more and more interested in listening to patients and their stories, and eventually moved into palliative care, which I think for me was a really good move, because that's all about an interaction between hard science, what neurotransmitters are involved here, what's the anatomy doing, what's the pathology, and spirituality in the broadest sense, and about the relationship with people. And so those two things dancing from one to the other is something that I find really interesting, and which is why I was fascinated when we started talking about your book and the ideas in that, as to how some of the things that I've been thinking about in individual terms, relationship one person with another, also start to work in bigger groups and with people, organizations, large and small, and that's a really interesting area to explore.
Thanks, Tim. So maybe just to kick this off, I can just give you a question to consider, and perhaps Tim, you could start on this one. But as both of you will know, you can't force connectedness and collaboration. So from your experience, how do you prepare the ground for it to happen?
I suppose you have to start by acknowledging that it matters, and so individuals have to recognise that it matters, and it's not some sort of bolt-on extra, the try and have a good bedside manner or try and be a good leader, but actually to recognise that unless you have that connectedness, unless you have that recognition of relationships mattering, then what you're building on has not got good foundations. So that would be the starting point, I think.
Okay. Ben, would you want to add to that?
Well, I'd certainly endorse that. I think there is no substitute, is there, for us spending time talking to each other, building relationships. And in the context, what we're talking about in relation to your book, Nick, as well, making more people aware of some of these ideas and how much they matter in order to try and foster the conversations in the right place at the right time. I'm very struck how much, I don't know whether it's just post-COVID or where we are at our particular juncture in our sort of national life, but we've all withdrawn into some of our boxes and tribes, and we don't spend enough time talking to people who are different to us, who think differently, and we need to find a way to get back to some of that, because out of that comes understanding and comes connectedness.
Brilliant. So it's clearly, as Tim says, it's making sure that it matters. It's not just a bolt-on, and that we may actually, because of COVID, possibly be kind of working backwards slightly. So how do we change that narrative? How do we get into that conversation where we encourage people to talk more about this topic, make it to make it seem important? How would you suggest we kind of begin to push this conversation, I think? Tim, do you want to?
Yeah, it's hard because a lot of the ways in which policy is decided and the way in which the academics sometimes look at this sort of stuff is based on a very reductionist model and things that you can measure and give numbers to, and that matters. You know, if I'm having a stroke, I want somebody to give me effective thrombolysis and get me to an MRI scanner or CT scanner really quickly. But then that's only a part. To try and say that that can apply across the board is wrong. And I think the sort of work that you've been doing, Nick, and others I know, Kieran Sweeney and others, so looking at these longer term relationships actually producing better results. There's evidence that doctors, patients who have the same doctor, same GP for longer periods, actually have better health outcomes than ones who go from one to the other, even if there's a good record of what's been happening. It's not the same as seeing people. It's not the same as longer term relationships. So I think that's that's a kind of evidence that starts to help us to make the case out for, you really have got to make systems that recognise this and value it and promote it as a bedrock of everything. And
do you think, Tim, that that's you've got an even playing field? If you've seen your same GP all the time, you know what to expect. And sometimes interacting with medical care, some you have great experiences with and you go, that was great and I really enjoyed that and that was good, and I got the information I wanted and I got some treatment, etc., etc. Then some are just, they're overrun, they're fraught, it's bad, they don't follow up, so it's really inconsistent. So one is great and one is really inconsistent. So when you're going in, you haven't got any, you don't know what you're going to get. So you already have a barrier up to go to a GP because you don't know what to expect. Who am I going to see this time? It's Bob. I don't know who Bob is. There's a locum that's come in. I don't know how he's going to be. And you know, invariably they're okay, but you've wasted 5 minutes of that appointment just trying to get an idea of what's Bob about and that sort of thing, rather than talking about what's wrong with you. You know, and there's a lot of that in that relationship, so that matters a lot. And then across the board, if you can even out the service, then that would be, you'd know where you stood, you know what happens next, so you wouldn't be worrying about that wouldn't be the first thing you do. Would that make sense?
It does, and I think it makes sense at several levels. I mean, just occasionally seeing a new doctor is a really good idea because they're suddenly really, blimey, you know, have you thought about X? You know, that can happen. I mean, Parkinson's would be a very good example of that. Disease creeping up insidiously, and someone who looks at you anew can often spot that when someone is not. But it's also about, we're thinking about relationships and narrative. If you've seen somebody 10-minute appointments, but over quite a few years, you've actually got quite a long time there. So there's an element of trust. I think that makes a difference.
Yeah.
I think there's an element of, hang on a minute, Tim, you don't normally come to me with something like this. What's going on? So there's a bit of that. And I think there's also another level of communication and the stuff which is not handled by our normal model. We've got to be a bit careful here about this. But I believe that coexisting with the conventional treatments, conventional scientific treatments, we've got plenty of evidence for. There's also things like healing interactions. There are elements of communication between people at levels that we don't normally think about. Example, I go and see a patient at 5 o'clock on Friday, I'm about to get home, and they say, oh, Tim, could you just go and see so-and-so? Oh, good. And I go and see them, and I'm knackered, and I know how to look professional. I've got them on my side. And then something happens. I get interested in what's happening. My energy level rises. And I believe there is a level of communication, a level of exchange of, let's call it energy as a shorthand. for something, and I really want to know, and there's a real possibility of some useful interaction. And so it's that two-wayness which I think is not accepted. It's, you know, it's a sick doctor that's not healed by his patients, and I think that's got something to do with this.
I think the other thing, Tim, that you talk about this duality, and the other thing, just you mentioned Kieran, who was my great mentor in terms of understanding the science behind this approach. He would often talk, Tim, about the importance of, in a consultation, switching astutely between the biomedical model, the clinical model, and the story. Because I remember him right at the beginning of our relationship telling me this wonderful story about he'd been asked by the practice nurse as a GP to review a whole lot of data patient data on a range of things. An elderly lady, she was in her 70s, I think, and he knew her well, so it wasn't like a new relationship. And he said she came into the surgery, and he kind of started going through some of the results and how they could deal with it in a biomedical way. You know, I could do this for you, I could do that for you. And he said, you know, after what seemed like an age, and he said it probably was only 30 seconds, but it felt like a long time. She said, well, my husband's dead and the boys are in prison. And almost, I'm not sure why I'm bothering with all this. And he immediately realized that actually he had to shift the conversation. There was a cue there, and it made for a better outcome. And I think it's that ability that often as operators, we don't have the skill in moving the conversation in different ways according to the context, because you're absolutely right. You know, if I have a heart attack, I don't want somebody asking me my story. You want some immediate response, don't you? Then the story comes afterwards, perhaps. But there are other times when actually that story, that narrative, is a critical part of the conversation to move something forward. So I think it's this ability to operate. That maybe there's a skill set that we don't train professionals for in helping to move between the two and understanding the importance of the technicals, if I can put it that way, and then the story, understanding the context. Because again, I've always learnt, both personally and organisationally, that context is critical, because it creates either a personal identity or an organizational identity. And I think we just need to be astute, perhaps, in the way we think about our organizations and the way forward in that. And that's a kind of a message that I'm trying to push in the book, really. It's not one thing or the other. I'm not saying forget the medicine or forget the clinical. Actually, just think about the human relationships in this, because actually all the evidence is that ultimately produces the better outcomes. If you focus on, if you like, people may have experienced trauma in their past life, and actually it isn't about just getting them a job, for example, as a way of dealing with an issue of their isolation or their rehabilitation, but it might be about, actually it's more about giving them hope and meaning. A job might do that, but it's a means to an end. So we just need to think more about, I think, the context within which we deliver services for people with complex social needs. And I wonder, Tim, in your work in the hospital, I know you've been working in the hospice, haven't you, in recent years, how you kind of how the organisation of the hospice reflects this agenda that we're talking about, and how perhaps you've been able to promote that in that context, or not, as the case may be.
I think one of the reasons it suited me as a job, and I agree with everything you've been saying, particularly being very moved by Kieran's story, which I've heard him tell, exactly that story, and it's a really good illustration, because certainly And palliative care, the World Health Organization says the spiritual care of patients, families, is actually very much part of it. It's written down as that. And hospice, good palliative care, recognises that. Spiritual, big debate about what you mean by that, but it's got to be to do with a quest for meaning. Sometimes we'll overlap religion, sometimes we'll bump into religion in passing, sometimes be independent of religion. And so it's embedded in the palliative care culture, the hospice culture, that if you're going to help people at the end of their lives with facing life-limiting illness, you can only do that effectively if you take notice of both of those things.
Yes.
You need to know their renal function. You need to know what painkiller you can give them. That matters. But it also matters to metaphorically put the top back on your pen and say, what are you frightened of? You know, and I think your point about context is everything, actually.
Yeah.
There are times when you do one, there are times when you do the other. And sometimes, you know, complementary therapies, those kind of things, can get a bad name because they can want to be alternative to mainstream medicine. And I think they need to exist together. Complementary is a much better term.
Yeah.
I think.
Ben,
your reflections on this thread of conversation?
Very interesting listening to colleagues, really. I know, Nick, when you asked me to write the introduction to your book, I did a lot of thinking about some of the messages that you were sort of talking about and the strands you wanted to pull together. And one of the phrases I think I came up with was about the need that you'd articulated, I guess, a need for us to rehumanize our public services, and that particularly in the context after COVID, when you were writing the book. And I think that word speaks very strongly to what Tim has talked about, really, that human interaction right down at the coalface, kind of patient to practitioner, whatever the context is in public services. And I think I would endorse the view, yes, we could probably train people to do that better. I think some of it probably comes with skill and experience as you get older and wiser and you learn more flexible ways of working. It's harder to do that when I've listened to primary school teachers straight out of university, etc. You know, they're bubbling with enthusiasm, but actually they've been conditioned and trained in a certain way, and it's very easy sometimes for that more natural skill set that you see in people who are in their 40s, 50s to come across. But I suppose I wanted to go back to your question really at the top of the podcast, which was more about kind of, you know, how do you get that connectedness and collaboration almost in a macro context rather than down in the micro context that we've obviously had to talk about. And I think I come back to, we have to find ways to get more people to think differently and be open to new ideas. We have got locked in some very paradigmatic models and ways of doing things. And as we've talked in the first episode of the podcast, the context we have is that if we keep doing the same things with even less money, we're not going to get any closer to the outcomes that we actually want. So we need those brave leaders. We need people who are able to think and talk differently, and we have to find a way to sow more of the messages and the insights that you've offered us through your book to a much wider audience. And I know you and I personally have talked about your legacy on the back of this book, and I think one of the questions I would put back to you is, you know, how do you make more people aware of some of the messages that you want almost the next generation of social leaders to have in their toolkit going forward?
I mean, I think there's two answers to that question, Ben. One is, I mean, part of doing the podcasts have been about pushing that message out to as wide a possible audience, and I think that's where I've been looking to Steve in terms of my production manager to help me with those the widest possible bandwidth, if I can put it that way. But I think there's another part to your question is, what next? And what next for me? I mean, I think certainly from my own personal point of view, I've made a decision in the rest of my working life that any contracts, any pieces of work that I get involved in, or indeed anything I do as a volunteer, like, I'm chair of a charitable trust that works with offenders, is everything, perhaps implicitly rather than explicitly, is about promoting these principles. So I've got a piece of work coming up with a client, and the client well knows my set of the way I work and what's important to me, and he's contracted with me on that basis, which I find very encouraging. He's not expecting me to, start off with the theory. There's a piece of work to be done in relation to a particular set of issues that he needs to tackle. But there is an acknowledgement, I think, that way of tackling it is likely to have more sustainable results. And I've actually been able to show him that in other pieces of work. So I think it's about, I'm very, as you know, Ben, very taken by the New Zealand rugby's mantra of, if you put the black jersey on as a New Zealand rugby player, your task is to leave the team in a better place. Yeah. You're not told you've got to win 10 games or 50 games. It is about what they see as basically their mission. And I think all I can do is, make sure I use the opportunities afforded me, and will be encouraging everybody I converse with to do the same, to think about the sets of principles which for me underline this approach. In other words, for me, it's not a blueprint that actually you can say, well, it's exactly this is the plan that you draw. It's for me saying there's a set of principles here which will move us into this way of working. There are values that underpin that as well, and we need to promote that against some of the stuff that will be fed back about, how do you achieve this in 3 weeks, because that's what we're giving you. And I do recognize some of the challenges of the time, and there is the public purse, as I think we've talked about a number of times in this. And if the public are paying for a service, they have a right to accountability for what it produces. But even just today, listening to the radio this morning, the public's view of their satisfaction with the NHS at the moment, I think, is the lowest it's been for 40 years, something like that. I heard this. In other words, we've got a real opportunity to use this to shift that satisfaction back, because there isn't going to be a tonnage more money. So it's, how do we use what money we've got? And I think, as far as we can, we have a responsibility to try and change the narrative. And I think, you and I, Ben, have talked about whether we can find, there's a seminar we could do, or there's some training we could offer. But what I've encountered so far, and I need to rethink this through, because it may be the way it's sold, but actually we're too busy for a seminar on this. Yep. It's an add-on. Yep. It sounds interesting. So, where I, throwing the question back to me, there are some challenges about, okay, how do we sell this as essential rather than add-on? And I don't know the answer to that. I can't, but I think that's the challenge facing myself. Yeah. If you put it back into a personal, but, that's been I guess for me, in coming towards the end of this podcast, I realized my mission over a lifetime was not to be a Catholic priest, but more to press, as one of many, pushing a different agenda in the delivery of our public services. And, I think that's where I am at this moment, I'm realizing there is I'm clear now, I guess, in a way I haven't been clear It's taken me something like 60 plus years to get to this stage, but maybe I've, having got there, that's an achievement in itself. But I'm clear where I am, and I'm clear where my next steps are. And I guess that's what the book is about, trying to shout about, really. There is a different way of doing this if we have eyes to see and ears to hear.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? It's finding those ears to hear and to
Yes.
understand what could happen here. Because the value proposition is probably very strong if we're talking about it. You can do more with less money. Essentially, it's the underpinning message. If you think about this differently, you can get better outcomes for the cash that you've got, rather than, like Ben said, just reiterating the same process with less money. How's that ever going to be better or do the job? It's got to change. Something's got to change. It's madness to keep repeating the same thing and expect something different to happen out of it.
Tim, have you got any? Sorry.
Yeah, certainly when the NHS is concerned, I mean, it's clear that the NHS has got lots of terrific things going for it. It definitely needs more money. It definitely needs a longer term view, but there are limits to those things, and I think anybody who's had dealings with it recognises that there are things wrong with the way it's organised, and there are things that get in the way of people doing their best for the patients, and there are systemic problems. And what we do not need is another re-disorganisation where the whole thing is just thrown up in the air again, and some politically or ideologically motivated new system is imposed. And I was very struck by, you say it in several ways, but certainly once where you talk about people don't resist change, they resist change imposed on them from above. And a lot of the time something's imposed, people keep their heads down, wait for it to blow over, wait for something else to happen, and try and keep the show on the road in the meantime. And I think, so if it could just be the powers that be, let's say the NHS, you could say probably we do need something like a Royal Commission to change that, to look at it from scratch with a blank sheet of paper. But it's got to also recognise that you need to ask the people who work in it.
Yes.
What's wrong? What stops you doing your job? That mid-staffs inquiry about the there. I don't know how much evidence there was of people being asked, you're a good nurse, you're a good doctor. What allowed this to happen? What allowed people to end up being part of this in a non-judgmental, non-blaming fashion?
Yeah.
And if you start to find out that, then you have the possibility of finding out. And I think, although we're looking at large systems here, in the end, it will boil down to a hospital, a clinic, a surgery, a team, and it's so how you empower the system to empower them.
Yeah, that's been a running theme through the whole podcast. Looking out and looking in is self-organizing groups, because people always fill the gap of a process that doesn't work by their own little process that they do, because they go, oh, this doesn't really work, but if I do that and do this and then squeeze it in at the end, it'll work, so they're already doing that, and it always happens, especially in huge organizations. So if they know what's going wrong, and they go, but I've shouted until I'm blue in the face, and then because nobody's listening, so then we're back to those ears to hear and eyes to see. If nobody's looking, they can't make any change. They give up, and they're probably really good people. They're just giving up and going, oh well, I'll just take the salary and I'll do what I can, and that's a crying shame, a real crying shame.
I think a question we should ask any politician that we bump into is, are you, when you say you're talking, are you listening, or are you just waiting to speak?
Yeah.
It's very true.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a big question, isn't
it? Ben, Tim, are there any other, in terms of this topic of connectedness and collaboration, are there any other strategies you think we need to think about in terms of facing the future?
I think I've got three things to sort of give you, Nick. They're potentially quite trivial, but they're kind of the food for thought that often forms the basis of the conversations that we've had over the years that then sometimes go to different places. I think one of them is very much about how do you spread the word? How do you get people to think differently? And I want to go back right to the very first episode where Steve was talking much more about technology and how we use it. And I think opportunities like TED Talks, TEDx, which you may have come across, much more operating on the sort of micro level, the opportunity to sort of spread ideas. And it's quite amazing how ideas then flourish, people build on them, you build that collaborative network that you're talking about far faster than you can literally do it in real time, wandering around your hometown, sort of meeting new people. I think the second bit is thinking about this next generation of leaders of our public services. They're not, as you say, going to sit in seminars like we did. They're not going to be reading probably some fusty old textbooks like we did. They are going to be accessing their thinking and their stimulation in short, rapid bursts through anything from TikTok to social media. And if that's how they're going to sponge-like pick up some of these new ideas, we need to provide the channels that get those new ideas to them. And I think the last bit, almost at the risk of setting you up for writing book 2, is I do think there's almost no such thing as it's never been done before. It's just finding out where it's been done before. And your book gave us a number of examples, some of them international examples. And certainly my experience of working with politicians is that if you can find the example from somewhere else and convince them that actually this might work, sometimes people are more prepared to take a risk and say it's worked in Sweden, it's worked in Australia, it's worked in Oregon, whatever it is, than be the first person to try and do something and find that actually it fails. So on that basis, I can set you on a journey traveling the world looking for the examples that illustrate the points you've talked about, because we only need the small examples that can then be grown up into the bigger things.
Yeah.
If you'd like to give me the budget, Ben, I'll happily send it off. But jokes apart, I mean, if that has legs, then you might find some organisation that would fund you to do it. So I don't, it isn't as flippant as I'm sounding on this, but clearly it's a challenge, and it makes me already think about one or two things I've read in a recent book about healing and medicine by Paul Dieppe. I think it's the book you gave me, Tim, to read, and what he does is he quotes examples from Norway and Finland to illustrate a particular issue about the connection between healing and medicine. And that did get me thinking about whether there are other places that, in so many words, have actually tried this approach at a bigger scale. So I fully take the point about that, Ben. So that's a good challenge to be left with. The only other thing I would say is I hate doing public talks. I hate that kind of front of house stuff. But you're absolutely right that that's probably the only way. Well, not the only way, but it's one important way of getting messages across. So I accept that challenge as well.
Yeah, well, I'm just waiting for your next TikTok video.
Oh God!
Yeah, no, we'll get you on TikTok. Everybody watch this space.
I think I'll have a few inhibitions to overcome there, Steve. But anyway, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything Ben's been saying, and not much to add to that. The only thing worth considering always is people always ask for evidence about this sort of thing, and where's the evidence it works, and I think that's where you have to say, what is the function of the evidence? What question are you asking of it? And therefore, what kind of data do you start to then look at? And if you're, and you've already got specific examples where what you have done, this approach of not top down, of listening to people, self-organization, saves money in budgets. So that's a very powerful kind of evidence. And the idea that collaboration, the idea that healing, the idea that the connectedness that we've been talking about, if you can start saying, well, actually, there is evidence about that. It's much more narrative, some of it's qualitative, but that is the right kind of evidence for the questions you're asking. Not just producing a bunch of p-values and numbers, which has a great point, is really important in some fields.
Yes.
You want to know which hypertensive works? That's what you want to, that's the kind of stuff you want.
Yes.
But if you want to know why people aren't taking their antihypertensives,
yes,
then you need a different kind of evidence.
And that for me is the storytelling bit, because it allows you to dig under behind numbers about the why, helps you with the why question, doesn't it? So Tim, Ben, thank you, and thank you for providing some really interesting food for thought and some, kicking it back to me in the nicest possible way, which is it's an ongoing conversation. For me, it is about leaving the Jersey in a better place through my efforts and no doubt your own efforts. So thank you very much. See you both soon, no doubt, in some place.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye.
Right.
Well, today we focused on not just how we work with individuals with complex needs in receipt of public services or working with public services, but how we work with organisations, particularly to facilitate emptying the waiting room and a new way of working. So we talked about how we prepared the ground for connection and collaboration, because I think three things cropped up. Firstly, it's about recognising that this issue of connectedness, collaboration and building relationships actually matters, and it's not just an optional extra. And there's absolutely no substitute for getting around and talking to people, but enabling the conversation to happen from the bottom upwards, not the top down. It's also, we recognised, about talking to people who may think differently. So you bring in all the perspectives. And we talked about how promoting long-term relationships, such as somebody having the same GP or the same social worker or same probation officer, there's evidence that long-term relationships promote better outcomes. We went on to talk about how connectedness and collaboration sometimes is not just what we see, but sometimes can be mysterious. And Tim was particularly talking about things like positive outcomes from healing interactions. It's often hard to judge the value of these things, but they do come through connectedness and collaboration and are really important, even if they're very difficult to measure. We also talked in this episode about how skills in building relationships requires us to know when to shift context. So the example we used was in, say, a conversation in a GP conversation, whereby the skill is in shifting from a biomedical model, almost in the same conversation, perhaps to a narrative model, if the issues surrounding the presenting issue are social rather than medical. And that's a skill that we do perhaps need to train professionals for. Particularly often we're trained these days in clinical work. And as Tim put it very nicely, sometimes we just have to put the top back on the pen and sit and listen rather than jump in. And I think ultimately what we were focusing on, Steve, was the need to rehumanize public services, something that I think since we've had this metrics market managers approach in the last 30 years has been lost. So I think Ben challenged me right at the end with, well, how are we going to shift this paradigm of work? So we considered things like, having to do podcasts to get messages across. I reflected on perhaps thinking now is the time to make sure in all the work that I do that I put into practice the principles I espouse and don't get sidetracked from that. And in particular, I think Tim talked very usefully about developing the value proposition of doing more with less. It isn't just about cutting things, but it's about rethinking. We can do things, as we've tried to suggest through self-organizing approaches, that actually are cheaper and more effective, and they cost less. So we kind of summarize that by saying often it's finding the right evidence, the right question we need. What's the particular evidence we need? So the value proposition is, the evidence of where a service is cheaper and more effective, and trying to put that back into the public eye.
Let's go over again what our takeaways are for this episode.